On the night of April 7th, 2014, 32-year-old Robin Spielbauer tucked her 10-year-old daughter into bed in their house in Amarillo, Texas. Robin told her daughter that she loved her, said goodnight, and then walked out of the room. Robin could hear the TV on in the front room of the house, and she began heading that way, but before she got there, she stopped to look in on her younger daughter. Robin peeked into her bedroom and saw the little girl was already fast asleep. And as soon as she saw this, Robin just felt this complete sense of calm come over her. As a single mother with 2 young kids, Robin's days could get busy and chaotic. But she was finally able to relax each night when she knew her daughters were safe and sound in their beds like they were right now. Robin left the bedroom and walked down the hall into the front room of the house, where she found her mom and dad watching TV. Robin took a seat on the couch with her parents, grabbed her phone out of her jeans pocket, and quickly sent a text message. Robin's mom looked over and asked her daughter if everything was okay. She was fine, just making some plans. Robin knew her parents loved having her and the 2 girls in the house, and they played a huge part in helping her take care of the kids. But Robin thought in a perfect world, she would not be living with her parents in her early 30s. Because for many years before she wound up back at her parents' house, Robin had been living a life she loved on her own. When she was 22, she had fallen in love with a great guy named J.D. Spielbauer. J.D. was a former United States Marine and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robin's father had been in the military most of his life, and so her parents had been really happy when Robin started dating a military veteran. Robin got pregnant just 2 months after they started dating, and so she and J.D. had their first daughter, then got married, and then they had their second daughter a few years later. And for Robin, ever since she was young, all she had wanted was to be a mom. And so she didn't really care that she and J.D. struggled with money sometimes, or that raising kids really wasn't always easy. She and her husband loved each other, and they had these 2 beautiful girls. That was more than enough to be grateful for. But in 2012, after she and J.D. had been together for almost 10 years, everything began to change. J.D. became distant, and he started spending a lot of time away from home. And not long after that, Robin had discovered that J.D. was cheating on her with a woman named Katie Phipps, who just happened to be one of Robin's friends from church. After Robin had learned that her husband and friend were having this affair, she divorced J.D., took the kids, and moved back in with her parents. And not long after that, J.D. had married Katie Phipps, which really only added to the tension. Back on the couch, Robin's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the text, smiled, and got up. She told her parents she would have to run out for a bit, and asked if they could watch the kids while she was gone. Her mom said of course, and then asked if Robin was going out to meet her new boyfriend. Robin blushed a little, but didn't respond. Then she just grabbed her purse, told her parents she wouldn't be gone too long, and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, at about 9:30 p.m., Robin drove her black Chevy Tahoe out of town and turned onto Helium Road, which was a long, winding dirt road surrounded by farmland on both sides. As she drove, Robin cranked up the country music on the radio and looked out at the huge Texas night sky. The only light on the road came from her headlights and the moon, and this made Robin feel like she was out in the middle of nowhere. But that was perfect as far as she was concerned. In fact, that's why she'd chosen Helium Road for this meeting in the first place. She didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do. Eventually, Robin pulled her SUV over to the side of the road, put it in park, and began to wait. And as she did, she listened to the radio and looked out the window. And then eventually, she saw headlights coming down the road behind her. The following day, at noon, almost 15 hours after Robin had left her house, a middle-aged man drove his truck down Helium Road. The sun was bright, and it was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It looked and felt like a perfect spring day. As the man was driving, he spotted something in the distance, so he slowed down and squinted. And he was surprised by what he saw. 3 young girls were running down the road right towards him, and they were screaming. This part of Helium Road was usually pretty deserted, and it wasn't really a place where kids played. So the man immediately hit his brakes, put his truck in park, and stepped outside to see what was going on. He walked over to the girls and asked if they were okay. And without breaking their stride, all three girls pointed behind them and started yelling, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man looked where the girls were pointing, and he saw there was a black SUV parked on the side of the road. He told the girls to stay where they were, and then he ran over to the SUV. And when he got there, at first glance, it just looked like somebody had abandoned the vehicle. However, when he walked to the passenger side of the SUV and looked at the ground, he just froze. The man was in total shock at what he saw, and it horrified him that three young kids were clearly the first ones to have stumbled onto the scene. The man took a breath and steadied himself, then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. A little later that afternoon, Sergeant Alan Mongold of the Randall County Sheriff's Department sped down Helium Road. Up ahead, he saw there was an ambulance, cop cars, and a fire truck, and then behind him, driving as well, were more police cars. Sergeant Mongold could not think of a time ever when this spot on Helium Road, basically in the middle of all this farmland, had been so crowded. He eventually pulled over and parked his car not far from a black SUV and got out. And immediately, an officer ran over to meet him and said he'd taken statements from the three young girls and the man who had been there when he arrived, but he'd arranged for the girls to be taken home, and he'd sent that man on his way. Mongold said that was fine. He would follow up with them if he needed to. And then he and the other officer walked around to the passenger side of this black SUV, and they joined a group of paramedics who were already standing there. But as soon as Mongold looked at the ground just outside the car, it was clear the paramedics could not do anything. Because lying there on the ground was a woman's body. And based on all the bugs crawling on her, Mongold knew she must have been dead for at least several hours. Mongold put on his gloves and crouched down next to the body. The woman was on her back, and immediately Mongold saw a deep dark bruise on the left side of her head. And at first glance, this bruise did not appear to be something she got just from falling down or something. It looked like something had been smashed into the side of her head, like a heavy object. And so at this point, Mongold felt confident he was very likely dealing with a murder. He reached into the woman's pockets, but found they were empty. So he told one of the officers on hand to run the plates of the SUV. And then he and the others started to do a sweep of the area. Within minutes, Mongold saw the officer who had just run the plates waving him over. Mongold joined him, and the officer said that the SUV was registered to a woman whose name was Robin Spielbauer, and the image of Robin Spielbauer that popped up matched the victim. Pretty soon, members of the county's forensics team arrived, and Sergeant Mongold searched the area around Robin's body and her SUV again. And this time, a forensic tech saw something that seemed really strange. The back windshield of Robin's SUV had a small crack in it, and embedded in the crack were tiny pieces of hot pink plastic. Now, neither the forensics tech nor Sergeant Mongold had any idea what this pink plastic was from. But the tech said hopefully that would become clear after they ran some tests. The investigative team spent hours searching up and down Helium Road, hoping to find a potential murder weapon or maybe Robin's cell phone. But other than those pink plastic flecks on the SUV windshield, there really wasn't much to go on. Mongold considered the possibility that this could have been a robbery gone wrong, that someone had gotten Robin to stop her car, attacked her, and had stolen her purse and her phone. But the idea that a carjacker would choose this road to try to rob someone where there wasn't a whole lot of traffic just didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so Mongold couldn't help but think that maybe Robin's killer was someone she knew. The following morning, April 9th, Sergeant Mongold sat at his desk reviewing the autopsy report. The report stated that Robin had most likely died the night before her body was found, and then her body had just laid outdoors on the side of the road overnight. And even more importantly, the autopsy report confirmed that Robin had been murdered. Because in addition to the blunt force trauma wound that Mongold had found on the side of her head, the medical examiner had also discovered a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol in the back of Robin's head. So, that morning, Sergeant Mongold went to meet with Robin's friends and family to learn as much as he could about her. and also to see if anyone close to Robin owned a .22. Mangold had informed Robin's parents about the death of their daughter the previous night, and even without the results of the autopsy report, he had told them he believed there had been foul play. And so through their complete shock and grief, Robin's parents had given Mangold a list of the few people who had been closest to Robin. And now, Mangold decided to start with her new boyfriend, a bartender named Jared. But the conversation with Jared proved to be pretty uneventful. Jared said he'd been working at the bar the night that Robin had died. He said she hadn't called him or texted him or anything. And Mangold was able to quickly track down multiple people at the bar who corroborated Jared's alibi. Now, the detective had no intention of crossing Jared off his list this early on, but Jared did not jump out as an obvious suspect. And so Mangold figured if Robin's current boyfriend didn't look like a major suspect, well, the next logical step was to talk to her ex-husband, J.D. Spielbauer. Later that day, now over 24 hours after Robin's body had been found, Sergeant Mangold knocked on the front door of J.D.'s house. And as he knocked, Mangold felt a bit surprised by where he was standing, because J.D. lived only a few houses away from Robin's parents' house. The door opened, and a woman who looked like she was in her late 20s with long brown hair and bright blue eyes was standing there. Mangold introduced himself, and the woman said her name was Katie, and that she was J.D.'s wife. She said news had traveled fast, so she already knew about the murder, and she assumed that's why Mangold was here, to talk about it. Mangold nodded, but before he could say much more, a tall, thin man with a cropped military-style haircut stepped outside. He introduced himself as J.D. Spielbauer. But immediately, his wife, Katie, snapped at him and told him to shut up, because she was talking to the police. J.D. immediately hung his head and fell silent. Sergeant Mangold acted like he didn't notice any of that, but in reality, he was taken aback. Married couples, even ones that didn't necessarily get along, rarely lashed out at each other in front of him, especially when they knew they could be potential suspects in a murder case. But Mangold remained calm and polite and asked them where they'd been the night that Robin died. Katie said that she and her son had been at a friend's house, and they had come home around 10 p.m. J.D. said he'd been home all night with his uncle, who also lived in the house. They'd just been drinking beer and playing some pool. Other than Katie's quick outburst at J.D., nothing the couple did after that seemed particularly strange. However, for some reason, Mangold just felt like there was a good chance both of these people were lying to his face. He talked to them for a bit longer, and then as they wrapped up, he told them he would be in touch if he needed any more information. But as he walked back to his car, Mangold already knew he'd be calling J.D. and Katie down to the station soon. He just needed to be better prepared if he was really going to interview them. After leaving J.D. and Katie's house, Mangold drove a few minutes across town to Robin's best friend Erin's house. Robin's parents had told Mangold that Robin and Erin were extremely close and shared basically everything with each other. So Mangold thought she'd be a great person to talk to learn more about Robin, but also he figured if anybody had inside information on Robin's ex-husband and his new wife, it might be Erin. And as it would turn out, Erin knew a whole lot about Robin's ex and his new wife. She told him that at one point, she, Robin, J.D. and Katie had all been friends. But then J.D. and Katie had an affair and things got ugly. She said Robin constantly worried about the kids and wondered if she and J.D. should really be trying to co-parent them. Erin also said that J.D. talked a lot about suffering from PTSD because of his time in combat as a Marine. Mangold took notes on everything Erin was telling him. An affair, a divorce, and a potential custody battle could all be motives for murder. And while Mangold did not believe that all military vets suffering from PTSD were inherently violent, JD's condition was still something he had to consider. But Erin would tell Mangold something else that would instantly make him rethink his entire approach to JD and Katie. Erin said late last year, Robin had gone over to JD and Katie's house to drop off the kids. However, when Katie had come in and seen her husband and Robin talking, she screamed, grabbed Robin, slammed her into the fireplace, and threatened to ruin her life. That evening, Sergeant Mongold led JD into an interview room at the sheriff's station, and then he sat down next to him at a small round table that was pushed up against the wall. JD was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that he kept messing with like he was nervous. Mongold had spent most of the previous night trying to learn as much as possible about Robin, JD, and Katie's relationship, and he had worked with the phone company to secure a copy of text messages sent to and from Robin's cell phone. Mongold started the interview by asking JD to give him an overview of what he'd been doing on the night Robin died. JD spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He was polite and addressed Mongold as Sir, and he said basically the same thing he'd told Mongold when they met at the house. He'd been hanging out with his uncle at home, drinking and shooting pool. Mongold nodded and asked if he'd seen Robin at all on that day, but JD shook his head and said he had not seen or talked to her. Sergeant Mongold reached down and grabbed a file folder out of a briefcase. He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Then he turned to JD and said he wanted to help him because clearly JD was having trouble remembering things clearly. Mongold told JD that this piece of paper was a record of all the text messages Robin had sent and received on the night she died. And her final text exchange was with JD, just before 9:30 p.m. And it was clear from this text that the two of them had been planning to meet up that night. JD immediately took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. He apologized for lying, and then as he tried to explain himself, he started to stammer. Finally, he got out that Robin was supposed to meet him that night at his house to talk about a standardized test their older daughter was supposed to take. However, JD said Robin never showed up. At this point, Mongold really began to press JD. He asked him if Robin had never showed up, why hadn't he reached out to her? And JD really struggled to come up with an answer. He remained polite and kept calling Mongold Sir, but as he was doing that, Mongold got the impression that this was not a man who planned things out, or who could easily organize his thoughts. And so eventually, Mongold told JD that he could assume only one of two things. JD had lied because he was the one who murdered Robin, or he had lied to cover for someone else. JD just shook his head and said he would never hurt Robin. But Mongold snapped back and said, well, if you didn't kill her, who did? JD went quiet for a second, and then he looked up at Mongold and just said, I have suspicions. Now, during this interview, JD did not come out and actually say who he suspected, but Mongold thought it was pretty clear. In fact, Mongold had the same suspicion since he talked to Robin's friend Erin. So Mongold didn't waste any time. He let JD go, and then had JD's wife, Katie, brought to the station and into the same small interview room. Katie was wearing a sweatshirt with a pink camouflage pattern on it, and while her husband, JD, had looked very nervous when he came in, Katie, on the other hand, just looked mad. But before Sergeant Mongold could even ask her a question, she said she needed him, Mongold, to tell her something. She said she needed to know if JD was having an affair with his ex-wife Robin. Mongold said he didn't know if that was the case, but he did know that JD and Robin had planned to see each other on the night that Robin died. After hearing this, Katie broke down sobbing and put her face in her hands. She said she knew it. She knew Robin had been trying to tear her marriage apart because Robin had never gotten over JD after the divorce. But despite all the obvious anger Katie felt towards Robin, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Robin's murder. However, despite what Katie and JD said during their interviews, Sergeant Mongold still decided to secure search warrants for their house and their cell phones, and he felt sure he would soon be able to arrest one or both of them. On April 10th, so just 3 days after Robin's murder, Sergeant Mongold and the investigative team searched JD and Katie's house, and they quickly found a room filled with guns. Mongold didn't think that was strange, though. Amarillo, Texas was home to a lot of avid hunters, and most of the weapons in this room were hunting rifles. But one gun immediately caught the detective's eye. Sitting in an open case was a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol. Now, Robin had been shot with a .22. But that was not actually the only thing that made this gun stand out. This gun had hot pink plastic accents on part of the grip and the barrel. And when Mongold leaned down to get a better look, he noticed that part of the pink plastic on the grip was cracked, and that small pieces of the plastic appeared to be missing. And so right away, Mongold assumed that those small pieces of pink plastic that were missing must have wound up embedded in the back windshield of Robin's SUV. Investigators quickly found out that the gun was registered to Katie, and they even found photos she had posted on social media of her holding that gun. And later that day, when police searched Katie's text messages, they found something just as damning. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie had sent 336 text messages to JD, threatening to ruin him and Robin. And the final text message, number 336, which Katie had sent to JD about an hour before Robin had left her parents' house and driven out to Helium Road, said, "You started this, whether you want to believe it or not. I will finish it." The Randall County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office moved fast. On April 11th, 4 days after Robin's murder, they arrested Katie. However, before the case could go to trial, the DA wanted either a confession or clear evidence that demonstrated Katie had been driving on Helium Road on the night of the murder. Katie refused to confess. She just repeated her story that she had been with her son at a friend's house and then gone home at around 10 p.m. that night. Now, Katie's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the murder site at the time Robin was most likely killed, but that tower also would have pinged if she was driving from her friend's house to her house, so it was not the definitive evidence the DA was looking for. The search for some elusive piece of evidence that would ensure a guilty verdict began to frustrate the police. After all, Sergeant Mongold and his team had Katie's gun and her threatening text messages to JD, and they knew Katie had once slammed Robin into a fireplace. But Mongold and his team's hands were tied, because the DA's office had taken over the investigation. The DA's office wound up re-interviewing people connected to the case and also scouring surveillance footage from locations just outside of town to see if they could spot Katie's car pulling onto Helium Road. But none of this led to anything new, and the investigation dragged on for months. And so the DA began to worry that he would never find this piece of evidence that would definitively win over a jury. But on a day in July of 2015, over 15 months after Robin's murder, a woman who worked for the DA rushed into his office, and she had a very excited look on her face. She told the DA that she'd seen a story on the news about how certain cell phones left a clear digital footprint when they were connected to Wi-Fi. Essentially, police could use this Wi-Fi data to track exactly where a phone had been, which was far more information than a cell phone tower could provide. When the DA heard this, his face lit up. He'd never heard about this type of search. So he gathered his team, and they immediately got in contact with the phone and internet companies, and soon they were able to trace Katie's exact path on the night of the murder. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DA had been looking for. And not long after that, the DA got another big break when he was contacted by Robin Spielbauer's mom. She told him that she had just gotten this very bizarre phone call that she knew would help his investigation. And the information Robin's mom provided, along with the newly collected Wi-Fi data, finally solidified the case. Based on the information from Robin's mom, cell phone and Wi-Fi data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believed happened to Robin Spielbauer on April 7, 2014. That night, the killer drove their truck through town, trailing just far enough behind Robin so as not to be spotted. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the killer followed Robin out onto a dark dirt road. And after a few more minutes of driving, the killer saw Robin pull over and park. And so the killer slowed down as well and parked right behind her. Once they were stopped, the killer put on a pair of gloves, grabbed a gun from the passenger seat, and then stepped outside, leaving their headlights on. The killer calmly walked towards the SUV, raised their gun, and slammed it against Robin's back windshield. The windshield cracked, and the killer heard Robin begin to scream from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door of the SUV suddenly flew open, and Robin lunged out of the car and started screaming at the killer. But the killer just raised their gun. Robin saw the gun in the headlights from the truck, and she ran towards the farmland that surrounded the road, trying to get away, but the killer followed, and they aimed at Robin in the low light, and they fired. The bullet struck Robin in the back of the head. She stumbled, her body twisted, and she fell to the ground on her back. The killer approached and saw Robin was still breathing, so they aimed the gun at her forehead and pulled the trigger again. But the gun jammed. The killer panicked. They rushed back to their truck, glancing over their shoulder to make sure Robin was not getting up and running off. The killer found a tire iron from the truck bed, took it, and ran back to the side of the road where Robin was still laying on the ground. The killer held up the tire iron and swung it hard into the side of Robin's head. Blood spilled from Robin's temple out onto the ground. Now she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the side of the road. The killer leaned down and took Robin's cell phone out of her pocket. They searched her other pocket for personal items, but she didn't have anything else on her. So the killer walked over to her SUV, leaned inside through the open driver's side door, and grabbed Robin's purse. And then with that in hand, they shut the door behind them. The killer ran back to their truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road back towards their house in town. Once back inside the safety of their home, the killer walked right into their gun room, and they would put the gun they had just used to shoot Robin, a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol with a pink plastic grip, into an open gun case. At this point, the killer took a deep breath and began to calm down. They were convinced the police would eventually find this pink gun, and when they did, they would believe Katie had murdered Robin. Katie Phipps would stay in prison for over a year awaiting trial, while the DA's office tried to find evidence that would ensure her conviction in court. But Katie didn't murder Robin. Her husband, JD, did. It would turn out that Katie's suspicions about JD and Robin had been correct. JD, who had cheated on Robin with Katie, had now begun cheating on Katie with Robin. But JD knew Katie had caught on, and the whole thing had now turned into a total mess. He wanted both women out of his life, so he murdered his ex-wife and framed his current wife for the crime. On the night of the murder, the way JD had lured Robin to Helium Road was he had been texting back and forth with her to set up a meeting on that secluded road. That way they could carry on their affair without being seen. Police had considered JD a suspect, but the bulk of the evidence they found seemed to point to his wife Katie. She had sent hundreds of threatening text messages, had physically assaulted Robin, and had claimed she was going to, quote, finish what JD had inadvertently started. And when tests were run on Katie's gun, the pink plastic from the weapon matched the pink plastic police had found embedded in Robin's back windshield. And so, after only a 4-day investigation, police had arrested and jailed Katie. But over a year later, as investigators and the DA tried to shore up their case before going to court, new evidence came to light. Katie's phone had not been connected to Wi-Fi on the night of her murder. However, her son's phone had. And so using the Wi-Fi data from her son's phone, in connection with cell phone tower from Katie's phone, police were able to see that on the night of the murder, Katie's route was directly from her friend's house back to her own house. At that point, they realized Katie had been telling the truth. She did not kill Robin. Also, investigators came to believe that many of Katie's threatening text messages to JD might have been about divorcing him and exposing his affair, not about harming Robin. So with this new evidence, police released Katie from jail, and the DA admitted he had rushed to judgment about her guilt. Once Katie was out, investigators quickly turned their attention to JD. And one of the first things they discovered was that JD's stories about suffering from PTSD were a complete lie, because JD had never served in the military. It was just something he lied about to impress women. And so the fact he had successfully carried out this lie for years and had even convinced police it was true, helped lead the investigators to believe that JD was much craftier than they had given him credit for. They came to assume that everything he'd told them during the investigation was potentially a lie, and that he had the personality and the mental capacity to frame someone else for murder. And then finally, when investigators really began to move in on JD, Robin's mom contacted the DA about this bizarre phone call she got. She said that JD had called her and asked her to lend him a significant amount of money so that he could take his daughters on a trip to New York ASAP. With everything else investigators had learned, they saw this as a huge red flag. They believed the reason JD was trying to go to New York was actually just to make a run for the Canadian border. So they arrested JD before he could leave town, and they charged him with the murder of his ex-wife Robin. JD was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll have a chance for parole in 2046. Despite the conviction, some members of the sheriff's department continued to believe that Katie had played a role in this crime. But once she was released from jail, Katie was never arrested or charged again in connection with Robin's murder. On a late August morning in 2014, a 37-year-old graduate student named Zara Valentine stepped into a university building in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the first day of classes, and there was a big welcome event for all the new students. Zara was anxious, but also excited. After working for years in human resources, she decided to finally return to school and complete her PhD. Zara wove her way through the crowd to the sign-in table. She grabbed a name tag, then went into the main hall, where her new classmates were clustered around tables, meeting one another and enjoying some refreshments. But as Zara looked around the room, she couldn't help but notice that she was one of the oldest people in the graduate program. She'd always been a good student, but she'd attended college a long time ago. And so Zara suddenly worried she may not fit in with her much younger-seeming classmates. Zara took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knew it didn't do any good to get rattled on the very first day. But just then her stomach rumbled. She had been so focused on the new student orientation this morning that she had forgotten to eat. Zara made her way to the buffet table, took a plate, and loaded it with some snacks, just as the Dean of Students walked on stage. Zara listened to a speech about the noble journey of higher education as she snacked furiously on mini sandwiches. Zara waited until the dean ended his talk before going back for seconds. One morning, a few months later, Zara sat inside of a lecture hall typing notes into her laptop as her professor went over the latest assignment. All of her classes so far had been inspiring, but also mentally exhausting. Her program covered a lot of ground quickly, and she was determined to keep up. As Zara's fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind was suddenly distracted from her professor's voice by the sound of people whispering. Zara stopped and glanced around her to see who was doing it. But the students in the row behind her had their heads down, taking notes too. Zara turned her attention back to the front, but minutes later, the whispering behind her started again. This time, she spun around much more quickly to catch the gossipers in the act. But it was the same students as before, still just totally absorbed in taking notes. They barely even noticed Zara. Zara stared at them, watching their eyes and hands as they typed. She wasn't sure, but something about their behavior made her feel like her classmates were just pretending to take notes, that they had been whispering and this was all just a ruse. Zara did turn back around to her laptop and did her best to try to reconnect with the lecture, but now she couldn't focus. She was far too anxious to pay attention. Later that week, Zara was walking back to her apartment near midnight after a long study session at the library. On the corner of her street, she approached a neighborhood market. Despite the late hour, a couple of people were browsing the bins of fruit out front, while a few others were inside buying groceries. And a clerk stood behind the counter listening to the radio, looking bored. Zara knew she didn't have much to eat back at her apartment, so she went inside. Zara walked along the aisles looking at pastas and breads and condiments when a strange urge suddenly gripped her. She took a box of crackers off the shelf, pretending to read the back of it, and then slipped it into her backpack. She glanced at the clerk, but he seemed to be totally oblivious, still just listening to his radio. An electric thrill suddenly flickered through Zara's body as she realized she had just gotten away with shoplifting. She tried to play it cool, but she didn't want this feeling to stop. So Zara drifted over to a different aisle and slipped a fancy mustard into her pack too. And after that, some expensive chocolate. She almost laughed at how easy this was. Her brain was buzzing. By now, Zara's bag was feeling heavy with all her stolen items, so she made her way towards the entrance like she had looked around but, couldn't find what she wanted, and then as nonchalantly as she could, she walked back out the door onto the street. And then once outside, she strolled casually down the block, and then when she was out of sight, she gradually sped up until she was full on running. Nobody came after her though, and so Zara was consumed by this feeling of total euphoria. She had never done anything like this before. Back at her apartment, Zara spread out her haul on the kitchen counter, and seeing it all there was kind of surreal. It was amazing, but also at the same time, she was starting to feel kind of disturbed, like she couldn't believe she had done this. And then Zara's euphoric high kind of came crashing down, and she suddenly wondered if she should just take all this stuff back and apologize. But she didn't, and so she just kind of sat there with her feelings, wondering what had come over her. She had never stolen anything before, but it was like tonight some other personality had taken her over. A few weeks later, just before the school went on holiday break, Zara was back in class taking notes during another long lecture. Her mind raced as she did her best to keep up. Just then, she heard a familiar murmuring behind her. Zara tried to ignore it and stay focused on the professor's words, but the voices behind her got louder. Zara whipped around to scold whoever was being so rude, but when she did, everyone near her had their heads down, typing or writing. Nobody was making any noise. But the situation made Zara's blood boil. Here she was doing her best, while other students who clearly didn't care were disrupting the whole experience for everybody else and then pretending they weren't as soon as she looked at them. So Zara decided she was going to stop this behavior today. Enough was enough. The last time her classmates had interrupted, Zara had let it slide, but no more. Just because she didn't catch them in the act didn't mean they weren't whispering. She knew what she had heard. And not only that, she was positive they were whispering about her. Whatever they were saying, Zara felt like she deserved to know. And so, with a loud scraping sound, Zara, in the middle of class, abruptly stood up from her chair. The professor heard the noise and stopped talking and looked right up at her. And soon the entire lecture hall was turned towards Zara. Zara stared back, scanning the eyes of all the students and the professor, trying to figure out who had been whispering this whole time. Their blank gazes irritated her. They all looked guilty, but Zara refused to be intimidated. She told the whole class in a loud, angry voice that she knew what they were up to. They could keep trying to hide it, but she knew they were playing a game and she was sick of it. Zara almost pitied her classmates, how trapped they were in their characters, reciting staged dialogue and acting out their assigned roles. It was also blatant. She couldn't stand another second of it. Zara snapped her laptop shut, scooped it into her backpack, and stormed out of the classroom. The winter streets of Boston were cold and gray as Zara hurried back towards her apartment. She was eager to get home and away from all these people she couldn't trust. But as she ran down the hallway of her apartment building and approached her unit, she froze. Her front door was already wide open. Moving slowly in case there was an intruder, Zara tiptoed to the doorway and peeked inside. Furniture was knocked over, books and clothes were scattered everywhere. The place had been ransacked. Suddenly it hit her. Zara felt like a fool. Of course she'd been robbed by her own parents. She'd given them her spare key, and they must have come while she was at class. Zara knew they were in on the same game as all of her classmates and even her professor. Zara couldn't tell what her parents had stolen, but she was not about to let them get away with this. First, Zara deadlocked her door, and then she began surveying her apartment. She had a feeling that her parents had not only robbed her, but had also contaminated the place with some sort of poison. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets, looking everywhere, when her eyes suddenly landed on the refrigerator. Zara went into the kitchen and slowly opened the fridge door. Her groceries were still there where she had left them, but she knew something was off. Zara leaned in and smelled. Then she jumped back and slammed the fridge shut in disgust. She'd have to throw away all her food because everything inside of it had clearly been poisoned. Zara then picked up her phone to call her mother, Antoinette, and after a few rings, her mother answered. And Zara told her mother that if she or her dad ever came anywhere near her apartment again, Zara would hurt them. If they wanted this to get ugly, Zara wouldn't be the one to back down. Then she warned her mother to never call her again and then Zara hung up. 1 month later, on a drizzly winter morning in February, a psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Lean prepared to meet with Zara at a Massachusetts psychiatric hospital for the second time. Their first meeting had been 1 month earlier when Zara had arrived at the hospital accompanied by her very shocked parents and some social workers. By the end of that very first visit, Dr. Lean had helped Zara realize that the world was not out to get her. Instead, she was clearly having some sort of mental trouble and really needed professional help. And so Zara had actually agreed to check herself into that hospital for a full month of inpatient psychiatric care. Dr. Lean diagnosed Zara as suffering from a psychotic disorder, which is a serious mental condition that causes a person to have trouble staying in touch with reality. He put her on a regimen of antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication and ordered extensive blood tests. The blood test results revealed that Zara was not getting enough of several key nutrients. She was also anemic, which is when someone doesn't have enough healthy red blood cells to carry oxygen to the body's tissues. Anemia alone can make a person's behavior erratic, although very rarely to the degree that Zara had shown. Nevertheless, after that first meeting, Dr. Lean had prescribed Zara a variety of vitamin supplements to combat her anemia, along with the other drugs to help with her mental disorder. And so now, after a full month of care was finally done, Dr. Lean was eager to see how Zara was doing. Tomorrow was her final day of inpatient treatment, and Dr. Lean was hoping that his prescriptions had helped her get back to her usual self. Right on time, there was a knock at the door, and then Zara entered and took a seat. Dr. Lean's heart sank when he saw her. Zara looked as frail as when she'd arrived. Her skin was pasty and pale, and her hair looked thin and scraggly. Dr. Lean asked Zara how she was feeling, but she just shrugged. She promised she'd been taking all of the vitamins and all the medications that he'd prescribed her, but Dr. Lean wondered if she was actually telling the truth. It didn't make sense to him that the meds wouldn't have any effect. Dr. Lean was very disappointed, but he'd worked in psychiatry long enough to know how incredibly complex mental health really is. Patients respond to treatments at very different rates, and it might just take a bit longer for Zara to feel the effects of all of these medications. And so, Dr. Lean congratulated Zara on sticking with her treatment for the full month as promised, but told her that the next day her parents would be coming to take her home. He said he hoped that Zara would keep taking her medications until she fully recovered. Zara nodded blankly and stood to leave. As she did, Dr. Lean reminded Zara that she was always free to call him if she ever needed help, but Zara was already out the door and did not appear to be listening to him. The next day, Zara's mom, Antoinette, held her husband Robert's hand as they walked across the parking lot and into the lobby of the hospital where Zara had been staying. A receptionist at the counter told them that their daughter would be down soon. A few minutes later, Antoinette heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. She turned to see a nurse pushing Zara out in a wheelchair. Zara looked gaunt and exhausted. Antoinette rushed to give her daughter a hug, and when she did, her daughter's body felt like a bag of bones. Antoinette tried to be grateful that at least her daughter seemed calm, rather than hostile like before. She hoped this was maybe the first sign of improvement. Maybe her old self would return once she was settled back at home. Robert grabbed Zara's bag while Antoinette led Zara out of the building towards their car. But the drive home was very strained. Antoinette, at one point, tried to make conversation by asking Zara how the food was at the hospital, but Zara just shrugged. She said she hadn't really eaten much while she was there. Antoinette shot a worried look at her husband behind the wheel, and then a moment later, Zara told her parents that the doctors had all been gossiping about her, and the only way to stop the game was to stop eating, so she basically threw away most of her meals. Most days, Zara said she limited herself to a slice or two of bread and some water. Antoinette felt crushed. Zara's delusions had obviously not changed at all. She didn't know what to do or even where to turn for help. Eight months later, a primary care physician named Dr. Maggie Portis was studying Zara's file a few minutes before Zara was set to arrive for her appointment. Zara's story really intrigued Dr. Portis. Zara did not drink alcohol, she had never suffered a head injury, and she had no family history of mental health issues. And yet, she'd spent a month at a psychiatric hospital for delusional behavior without showing any signs of getting better. According to her family, her delusions were still as strong as ever. Since being released from the hospital, Zara had gone to a number of doctors who determined that she had a vitamin deficiency as well as a thyroid issue. Zara was given supplements to boost her iron and vitamin B, and her thyroid issue was treated successfully. But none of those treatments had any effect on her mental health. She was still totally delusional. While Dr. Portis was lost in thought, a nurse notified her that Zara and her mother were waiting for her in an examination room. Dr. Portis headed down the hall, eager to meet her new patient, but the moment she entered that exam room, she was struck by how hollowed out and desperate Zara looked. Dr. Portis introduced herself, then had Zara undress and step on the scale. Zara weighed only 99 pounds, despite being 5 foot 6 inches tall. Dr. Portis then had Zara sit on the examination table, while a nurse came and tied Zara's arm with a tourniquet, swabbed an area with an alcohol pad, and filled a syringe with her blood. Zara seemed to barely notice any of this. After the nurse left the room, Zara complained to Dr. Portis that she had been taking all of her prescribed vitamins and medications, but did not feel any better. Dr. Portis nodded. As Zara talked, the doctor suddenly had a hunch about why Zara was not getting any better. If her hunch was right, then of course Zara's meds wouldn't have had an effect, and her delusions would continue. Choosing her words very carefully, Dr. Portis told Zara that she thought she knew what might be causing her mental problems, but she wouldn't be able to tell for sure unless Zara had a procedure done. Zara's eyes lit up at the idea, and she immediately agreed to do whatever it took to make a change. She said she just wanted her old life back. Dr. Portis felt deep empathy for Zara. It was clear that she was afflicted by something that she really had no control over. Dr. Portis wrote down a name and a phone number on a notepad and handed it to Zara. She explained that it was contact information for a doctor who could perform a biopsy, which is a surgical procedure where tissue is removed from the body and then examined under a microscope. She promised Zara the procedure would be quick and painless, and it might bring her closer to solving her health issues. Zara clutched the piece of paper with both hands and thanked Dr. Portis. Then she sighed and leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and went limp with exhaustion. Dr. Portis wished Zara luck and then left them to have a moment alone. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless morning, a gastroenterologist, which is a doctor who specializes in diagnosing and treating diseases and conditions that affect the digestive system, named Dr. Simon Reed, shook his head in amazement as he surveyed the biopsy results of a patient's small intestine. In all his years in medicine, he had never seen a case quite like this one. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and Zara entered. She looked thin and very nervous. Dr. Reed thanked her for coming in and told her to take a seat, and then he asked her how she'd been doing. Zara looked away from the doctor and out the window and then down at her hands. She told the doctor she felt like her real life was behind her now. She used to feel like she was just entering a promising new chapter, being back at school to finish her PhD, enjoying her own apartment in the city and thriving in her studies. But then everything just kind of went off the rails. She started doing these weird impulsive things without understanding why. It became hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. She couldn't trust anyone anymore either, like her parents. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't even trust herself. Dr. Reed was moved by Zara's story. He could tell that she was desperate for help, but didn't know where to turn, which was why he was so happy to be able to be the bearer of good news. He told Zara that her primary care physician, Dr. Portis, had been smart to tell her to go get a biopsy, because it led to the breakthrough Zara had been looking for. The tissue sample they had taken during the biopsy showed that all of Zara's physiological and mental symptoms were being caused by the same condition, and best of all, it was treatable. Zara would only have to make one life change, altering her diet. At the word diet, Zara's body froze. She narrowed her eyes and squinted at Dr. Reed like she was trying to read his mind. He recognized it as the paranoid behavior detailed in Zara's file. She suffered from the delusion that basically everyone was lying and no one could be trusted. But Dr. Reed promised Zara that he really was telling the truth, that this was the only way for her to get better. If she changed her diet, the delusions she was experiencing would go away. If she didn't change her diet, her delusions would only get worse. But the look on Zara's face told the doctor that she was not buying any of this. She scowled at Dr. Reed and shook her head in disgust. Then she got to her feet and moved to leave, but then stopped by the door and turned back around. She pointed a finger at Dr. Reed and accused him of being part of the game like everybody else, another traitor and liar trying to trick her with food. She told him that she wasn't going to fall for it, and then slammed the door and stormed out. Dr. Reed just sat there motionless, unsure what to even do. He was completely stunned by what had just happened. Several months later, on an overcast spring morning, Antoinette Valentine huddled in the front seat of the family car next to her husband, Robert. She felt a sense of dread hanging over them. Antoinette looked out the window at the familiar silhouette of the State Psychiatric Hospital, a sight she had seen too many times lately. But she hoped today would be the last. Her daughter Zara was finally being released following a court-ordered 3-month confinement. After storming out of Dr. Reed's office 6 months earlier, Zara's life had totally unraveled. She stopped picking up phone calls or checking in with anybody. She failed to fill out the forms necessary to continue her PhD program. She quit paying rent on her apartment and soon got evicted. And before long, she was wandering the streets. Antoinette had not heard from her daughter in months until she had showed up at the family home, banging on the door in the middle of the night, acting completely erratic and strange. Antoinette tried to calm Zara down, but there was no reasoning with her. Robert had no choice but to call the police, who handcuffed Zara and took her away. Later, after Zara made more threats against them, Antoinette and Robert filed a restraining order against their daughter. Weeks after that, the phone rang in the middle of the night, and Antoinette immediately had a bad feeling. It was a nurse from a local emergency room with news that Zara had attempted suicide. She had been found alone and unresponsive, but fortunately, medics had been able to revive her. Since Zara's mental state was extremely fragile, she was being transferred back to the State Psychiatric Hospital, and so that was 3 months ago. But today, finally, Zara was being sent home. Antoinette took a deep breath, braced herself, and held her husband's hand as they walked into the lobby of the hospital. The receptionist told them that their daughter would be out soon. Antoinette could not stop pacing around the lobby as they waited. The last time she'd seen her daughter, Zara had been violent and disturbing. Antoinette worried that when she saw her daughter again, she would still be emaciated, or that she'd scream and throw a fit and refuse to go home. Antoinette's memory of their last encounter was still a fresh wound in her mind. But just then, there was the sound of footsteps, and Antoinette spun around. It was Zara, and she seemed like her old self, the one Antoinette remembered before all this started.
In a quiet town where shadows play, every corner knows our secrets stay. A place where time refused to rust, in the heart of memory. It's us.
Old cafe where laughter danced, bench where we shared our second chance, sidewalk whispers still repeat in the rhythm of our hearts that beat.
Memory lane where dreams align, is where every stone has a tale so fine. Our love engraved in every street. Here's where the past and present meet.
Zara was clear-eyed and smiling sweetly like she really was seeing her parents for the first time in a long time. Antoinette couldn't believe it. She rushed to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her, And this time, it felt like there was actually something there to hug. Zara was a healthy, normal weight again. Zara even hugged her mother back. Antoinette stepped back and looked her daughter up and down. She was speechless. Zara had this beautiful outfit on, and her skin had a healthy glow to it. Antoinette couldn't believe such a huge mental and physical transformation was possible in just a few months. What was even more amazing was that Zara's transformation was the result of something so simple. For the past 3 months, Zara had been eating only particular foods prepared by the hospital, following the recommendations made by Dr. Reed 6 months earlier, the one who suggested Zara change her diet. And now Antoinette saw proof that Dr. Reed had been right all along, just by looking at her healthy daughter smiling right in front of her. Zara's incredible improvement was entirely due to the fact that she stopped eating foods that contained gluten, a protein commonly found in foods like bread, pasta, pizza, and cereal. Dr. Reed had discovered that Zara suffered from celiac disease, which caused her body to have a severe reaction to any foods containing gluten. Though many people are diagnosed with celiac, often as adults, Zara's condition was the worst doctors had ever seen. Zara's immune system attacked the gluten that she ate so fiercely that it damaged her small intestine. Over time, her intestine became too inflamed to absorb vitamins or iron, no matter how many supplements she took. That's why she was so anemic and thin. But even worse, gluten triggered inflammation in Zara that didn't just affect her intestine, but also her brain too. In Zara's case, inflammation caused her brain to misfire, resulting in delusions and psychosis. She starved herself intentionally and became wildly suspicious of the people around her while starting to commit crimes herself. Not because she wanted to, but because it was like her brain was malfunctioning. But once Zara started a gluten-free diet, her inflammation subsided and the delusions were gone. Antoinette and Robert were ecstatic to have their sweet daughter back. The drive home from the hospital that day was one of the happiest in their family's history. Zara was affectionate to her parents and seemed very grateful to be thinking normally again. Zara understood now that gluten really was to blame for her life spiraling out of control, and so now all she wanted to do was make up for more than 1 year of lost time with her parents. Unfortunately, though, their joy as a family was very short-lived. A few months after Zara came home, Zara accidentally ate some food that contained gluten. Her delusions returned, but this time far more intensely. Once again, Zara became convinced that her parents were plotting against her, and this time she wanted to do something about it. Driven by her paranoid hallucinations, Zara went to her parents' house and tried to kill them. Thankfully, police arrived before anybody got hurt, but Zara was sent to jail. Unfortunately, we have no information on what happened to Zara after that, but her and her family's life has been forever damaged. All because of a little protein found in a slice of bread or a plate of pasta. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown.